Fridays with a Ranger is brought to you by the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. Hi, I'm Ryan Kephart, a historian with the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail, talking today from beautiful Maryland, just 20 miles from the White House, actually, in the shadow of the nation's capital, where President Thomas Jefferson and his young secretary, Meriwether Lewis, planned one of the greatest expeditions in American history. Well, 20 miles and 217 years, but hey, who's counting? Thomas Jefferson. That's who's counting. In this series of videos, we're going to be exploring the stories of Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery and their intrepid journey across the fledgling country into what was, to them at least, the unknown. So our nation's history is all around us, from the sights we see, to the things we do, to the stores we shop in, and the food we buy. Well, normally. When we aren't all observing safe social distancing practices due to the novel coronavirus, that is. Unlike the Corps of Discovery and these people congregating on the shoreline, this is an example of how not to social distance. In today's video, I'm going to be discussing one of my favorite topics, food. Lewis and Clark led a group of 33 people to the Pacific Ocean and back, with many more helping them along the way. One of the chief concerns for such an undertaking, as any parent on a road trip will tell you, was making sure that everyone was well fed. Despite the fact that the Corps crossed the Mississippi River with literal tons of supplies, including food, Lewis and Clark knew that their stores would not be enough to sustain the voracious appetites of the Corps. But how did Lewis and Clark feed that many people for that long? There were no restaurants, no supermarkets, not even a convenience store to stop at. For most of their food, the Corps relied on their hunters to supply them with meat, and meat served as the primary form of sustenance for the expedition. But unless you are an Olympic-level athlete, this much meat should not be your primary form of sustenance. We know from their journals that the men of the Corps would eat up to 9 pounds of meat per man per day when it was available. And from the evidence left behind, we estimate that collectively, the men of the Corps killed, cooked, and consumed at least 155,000 pounds of meat. In this painting, we can see members of the Corps of Discovery out hunting with their rifles as the Corps' greatest nemesis, a grizzly bear, looms in the background. On July 13th, 1805, Lewis wrote, "We eat an immensity of meat. It requires 4 deer, an elk and a deer, or 1 buffalo to supply us plentifully 24 hours. In that same entry, Lewis noted that the hunters killed 3 buffalo and set to skinning them and drying the meat in preparation for crossing the Rocky Mountains. Unlike us, though, the Corps of Discovery didn't have access to modern refrigeration or refrigerators or freezers or coolers to keep their meat from spoiling. Instead, they had to rely on techniques that had been practiced for countless generations before them, mostly drying their meat. Now, when possible, they would use salt to dry the meat. But salt was a pretty precious commodity in the early 19th century. Especially as far away from the salt works and the ports of the United States as the trail ultimately took them. The other technique that they used was smoking. The reason meat spoils is because of microorganisms like bacteria or the mold pictured here. And these microorganisms actually thrive on the same fats and proteins found in meat that our bodies do. There is, however, also another key ingredient that they need to survive: water. As this sizzling pot demonstrates, we can reduce water by evaporating it. And by reducing the amount of water in the meat, we reduce the number of microorganisms. And that gives us more time to eat the meat before it goes bad. Now, while Lewis and Clark didn't know about bacteria or germs, they did understand that preserving meat extended the amount of time before it went rancid. And besides, water is heavy.
So by reducing the amount of water in their food, they made it lighter and easier to carry during their journey, which came in especially handy as they crossed over the Rocky Mountains.
Many cultures, including some of the tribes that Lewis and Clark encountered, would preserve their food by dehydrating it. So when they were in need, Lewis and Clark would often trade with those tribes for food. The Mandans in particular were a great example of this.
Were it not for the support of tribes like the Mandans and the dried food they provided the Corps, it's doubtful that the expedition would have ever succeeded.
Now, there are lots of ways of drying out your food. You could use a dehydrator, if you had one, which the Corps didn't, or anybody in the 19th century for that matter. You could use salt, which the Corps did when salt was available, but it wasn't always. You could use the sun, actually, if there's direct sunlight. And you could even use air, just let it air dry, like your hair on a busy day. Though, unlike your hair, meat takes days or weeks to air dry and has other problems associated with it. So smoking was an attractive option because it was fast, and all you really needed was a fuel source, which in North America is pretty readily available.
Now, to our modern sensibilities, spending hours upon hours cooking and tending a fire may seem tedious, but compared to the days or weeks that it takes to let food air dry, smoking was the fast food of its day. Not to mention, hanging meat out to air dry for days on end also has an unintended side effect. It attracts bears. Now, the chicken that we are smoking today is a bit different from the big game that the Corps of Discovery smoked, not least of which because ours is being prepared on aluminum foil in a modern kitchen. Also, we're using a number of spices and flavorings that were commonly traded in the United States from 1803 to 1806. Garlic, onion, black pepper, even cumin. Salt, however, was the chief spice of the expedition, though, to be honest, that was more for preserving than flavoring their food.
Now, I know that someone out there is probably going to say, but Ryan, I've read the inventories of stuff that Lewis and Clark brought on the expedition, and spices like cinnamon were on the list. To which I say, bravo, well done digging deep on your history there. And yes, that is accurate. Spices like cinnamon were included on the expedition, but those were actually brought along for medicinal purposes. The army in 1803 wasn't overly concerned with making sure that their soldiers' food tasted good.
While preparing for the expedition, Lewis purchased hundreds of pounds of dried portable soup for his soldiers to eat. Jefferson's steely gaze in this painting is the appropriate response to that culinary fact.
Life in the early 21st century is very, very different from life in the early 19th century, especially along the Lewis and Clark Trail. So I bought this meat in a supermarket with a credit card, as opposed to, hunting it down myself with a black powder rifle. It came refrigerated and wrapped in plastic, as opposed to dried and salted or, wrapped in its own flesh. But one of the things I love about food is it's one of the great constants of history. It's something that, in my opinion, brings people together. Something that the members of the Corps of Discovery did every day was, eat, but more importantly, to stop and eat. They actually broke into mess units, and they would sit down and eat together. And I can only imagine that they looked forward to their lunch break as much as I look forward to mine, if not more, which is to say a lot. But food is about more than just putting calories into your body. It's about stopping and reconnecting with the world and recognizing that you're a part of it. And I think it's a great chance to appreciate the world around you. And honestly, it's delicious. Thank you for joining me.
Lewis and Clark remind you of the importance of social distancing. Remember, stay at least 6 feet apart, and when possible, wash your hands.
This is really good.
This has been Fridays with a Ranger, brought to you by the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. You can learn more by going to www.nps.gov/LECL or by following us on Instagram and Facebook at Lewis and Clark NHT. Our office, when not closed due to the novel coronavirus, is at 601 Riverfront Drive in Omaha, Nebraska, zip code 68102. Or you can reach us by phone at 402-661-1804. Thank you for watching, and stay safe out there.